The shot echoed through the frozen canyon, a crack of judgment in the dead of night. Inside the small cabin, bathed in the flickering firelight, Abigail clutched her children, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Outside in the swirling snow stood Silas. He wasn't just a man. He was a fortress, a bulwark against the world that had cast her out. He had opened his door to a ghost of a woman and her two shivering babes, offering a warmth that went deeper than his hearth. But this land, this wild, untamed West, did not suffer strangers gladly. Now, with the scent of gunpowder tainting the pine-sharp air and a body lying still in the snow, he had made his choice. He had drawn a line in the blood-stained frost. He had chosen her. And as Abigail peered through the frosted window pane, her gaze locked with his across the unforgiving night, she knew this was no longer just about survival. It was about a fierce, desperate, wild love being born in the heart of the storm. Part 1. The Thaw of a Frozen Heart. The wind was a living beast, a shrieking phantom clawing through the canyon, its talons ripping at Abigail's threadbare shawl. It stole the breath from her lungs and turned it to a mist of frost before her eyes. Each step was a battle, her worn-out boots finding little purchase on the treacherous, snow-choked trail. Samuel, her boy of no more than 6, dragged behind, his small hand a vice on the hem of her skirt. Clutched to her chest, bundled against the biting cold, was little Grace, a silent, unmoving weight. For miles, their world had been an unending canvas of white, a void of icy pines, and the soft, desperate whimpers of her children. Now, just as her legs screamed their final protest, just as the last flicker of her strength threatened to extinguish, she saw it. A cabin, a curl of smoke, a prayer against the bruised purple sky, a single point of light in a window. Salvation. Her knees gave way, but a will forged in loss and desperation drove her forward. One more step, one more ragged prayer whispered into the gale. She stumbled onto the porch, her shoulders striking the doorframe with a hollow thud that sounded like a death knell in the suffocating silence. "Mama?" Samuel's voice was a threat of sound. "Mama, don't sleep." Abigail's vision swam in a sea of black spots. She tried to form a word, a plea, but her voice was a frozen prisoner in her throat. Then, the door creaked open, the heavy thud of boots on wood. A figure loomed in the doorway, a silhouette against the warm light within. He was tall, broad-shouldered, a man built of the mountains themselves. A rifle was slung across his back, and his eyes, shadowed beneath a weathered hat, were as sharp and gray as flint. His gaze was a physical force, moving from her collapsed form to the children, one limp and pale, the other trembling with a fear that went beyond the cold. A long, taut moment passed. Then, without a single word, he knelt. The heavy scent of leather, wood smoke, and something wild and masculine filled the air. His greatcoat, a fortress of worn wool, dropped over Samuel. A powerful arm, calloused and sure, scooped Grace from her grasp. And his voice, when it came, was the deep, rough growl of shifting rock. "Get in." The command was not a request. It was a lifeline. Abigail tried to rise, her limbs refusing to obey. Before she could hit the ground, he caught her, his arm a steel band around her waist, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. He carried her like a man accustomed to heavy burdens, grief, solitude, maybe ghosts. Inside, warmth struck her like a physical blow. A fire roared in a great stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. He laid Grace on a cot in the corner, his movements economical and precise. He moved back to Abigail, pulling off his leather gloves and kneeling beside her. His fingers, surprisingly gentle, found the pulse at her neck, then checked her frozen hands, her cracked lips. His touch sent a jolt through her, a spark of life in the frozen wasteland of her body. "You hurt?" he rumbled. She managed a shake of her head. "Just cold." He moved with a silent, focused intensity, piling thick wool blankets over the children, tucking them in with a tenderness that seemed at odds with his rugged exterior. He pressed a steaming tin mug into her hands. It was coffee, black, bitter, and strong. "Drink," he commanded. She obeyed, the liquid fire blooming in her chest, chasing away the deadly chill. He watched her, his gaze unwavering, intense. It was a look that stripped away pretense, that saw the raw, desperate animal fighting for survival beneath the layers of grief and exhaustion. "Why are you here?" he finally asked, his voice low. Abigail's gaze drifted to her sleeping children, their small chests rising and falling in the firelight. Then back to him. "Nowhere else," she whispered. He gave a single, sharp nod, as if that were the only answer that mattered. 1,000 words of gratitude and sorrow and despair rose in her, but exhaustion was a merciless victor. Her head dropped, and the world began to fade. As sleep, dark and final, claimed her, she heard his gravelly voice slice through the fog. "Name's Silas. You're safe now." And in that instant, on a stranger's floor, with nothing left but borrowed breath and the startling primal heat of his presence, Abigail believed him. It was a dangerous, reckless thing to believe, but it was all she had. Part 2. A sanctuary of scars. Abigail woke to the scent of frying bacon and the low crackle of the hearth. For a disorienting moment, she was adrift, unsure if the cabin was real or just the last, desperate dream of a dying woman. Then she moved, and a chorus of aches from deep within her bones screamed a testament to her ordeal. Her eyes fluttered open. The cabin was a single room, Spartan but immaculately clean. One bed, one hearth, one table. It was a space built for solitude, a fortress against the world. And in the corner, alive and breathing beneath a mountain of quilts, were her children. A sob of pure relief caught in her throat. Silas was across the room, his back to her, a skillet in one hand. The breadth of his shoulders, the coiled strength in his stance as he stood before the fire, spoke of a quiet, self-contained power. He didn't turn. "They woke an hour ago. Fed him broth. James is a talker." His voice was flat, a statement of fact, yet beneath it, she heard a current of something. Not pity. Something closer to respect. The days that followed were a strange, silent dance. Silas was a man of few words, his actions speaking a language of their own. He moved with a deliberate grace, whether he was splitting wood with a single perfect strike of the axe, or tending to the children's needs with a gentle, clumsy care. He would leave food for her, a bowl of hearty rabbit stew, a slab of freshly baked bread, without a word, then disappear for hours to check his trap lines or hunt. Abigail in turn tried to make herself useful. She swept the floor, mended a tear in Samuel's coat with thread pulled from her own hem, and kept the fire fed. They orbited each other in the small cabin, two celestial bodies drawn together by a shared gravity of loneliness and loss. The air between them was thick with unspoken questions, with the ghosts of their pasts. One evening, as a fresh blanket of snow fell outside, muffling the world in a holy quiet, she found the courage to speak. He was cleaning his rifle by the firelight, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He paused, his hand stilling on the polished wood of the rifle stock. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Why what? Why did you open the door?" He set the rifle down, and finally turned to face her. The firelight carved deep shadows into his face, highlighting the lines of hardship etched around his eyes and mouth. "You were on my porch. I could have been anyone. A thief. Trouble. Trouble don't usually come with half-frozen babes," he said, a ghost of a wry smile touching his lips before vanishing. He picked up a piece of kindling, turning it over and over in his calloused hands. Storms bring all kinds to these mountains. The desperate, the lost, the running. He looked at her then, a direct, piercing gaze that seemed to see right through her. "Which one are you?" The question hung in the air. She owed him the truth. "All three," she confessed, her voice thick with unshed tears. "My husband. He died in a mine collapse back in St. Elms. The company took the house. There was no one, nothing left. We just walked. How far? 30 miles. Maybe more." A low whistle escaped his lips. He looked at her slender frame, her worn hands, and a new emotion flickered in his eyes. "Oh, and you made it through that blizzard. Damn." A fragile understanding began to form in the quiet space between them. They were both survivors, marked by the storms they had weathered. One night, she awoke from a nightmare, a strangled cry escaping her lips. Instantly, he was there, a shadow detaching itself from the corner where he slept on a bedroll. He didn't speak, just knelt by her cot, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor in the terrifying darkness. She could feel the heat radiating from him, a wild, untamed energy that was both frightening and intoxicating. She reached out, her hand finding his arm in the dark. His muscles were like granite beneath her touch. "I'm not the woman I was," she whispered into the darkness, a confession. "Life, it scraped everything away." His hand covered hers, his thumb stroking the back of her hand in a gesture of surprising tenderness. "Scraped, don't mean gone," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. "Sometimes you gotta burn down to the bedrock to build something stronger." His words, his touch, the raw, masculine scent of him, it all combined to stir something deep within her. A feeling she thought had died with her husband. It was a dangerous, thrilling heat that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. It was the frantic, desperate beat of a heart realizing it might not be frozen after all. And in his eyes, she saw an answering spark, a hunger that mirrored her own, promising a fire that could either warm them or consume them both. Part 3. The Judgment of a Wary Town. 3 days. 3 days of a fragile and brewing peace. Then the sound of hoofbeats, crisp and sharp in the frozen air, shattered the silence. Abigail was outside, her breath fogging as she scrubbed a small shirt in a basin of icy water, when she saw them. 2 riders cresting the ridge. Wade emerged from the barn, his face a mask of stone, his jaw set. He didn't say a word, just moved to the porch, the shotgun he'd been cleaning now, cradled in his arms. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs. James peeked from the cabin window, his eyes wide. The riders reined in their horses, their boots crunching on the ice as they dismounted. One was older, with a gray beard and the watchful eyes of the law, Sheriff Langley. The other was Travis Finch, a man whose prosperity from the town's trading post had made him narrow-minded and suspicious. "Morning, Silas," Langley called, his hand raised in a gesture of peace that didn't reach his eyes. "Heard a rumor. Woman and 2 children, near half dead on the ridge. Figured we'd check it out." Silas didn't move a muscle. "They're here." Langley's gaze flicked past him, landing on Abigail. He took in her worn dress, her bare hands red from the cold water. "That's so. She wanted for anything? She's with me," Silas said, his voice flat and final. The words hung in the air, a shield between her and the world. Finch spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "Don't mean she's safe. We had Apache raids last season. Things go missing. A stranger shows up from nowhere, kids in tow, no story? Makes folks nervous. Town can stay nervous," Silas replied, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Ain't their concern. Now, Wade," Langley sighed, using a name she hadn't heard before. "We ain't looking for trouble, but you taking her in. That's a choice you made for all of us. You know how people talk. I made a choice for her." Silas corrected, his grip tightening on the shotgun. The knuckles of his free hand were white. There was a protective fury simmering in him, a primal possessiveness that sent a shiver of fear and a wave of something much hotter through Abigail. She couldn't stay silent. She stepped forward, her spine straight, her chin high. "My name is Abigail Moore. My husband died in the St. Elms mine collapse. I walked 30 miles through a blizzard to save my children. I haven't stolen. I haven't begged. I have only survived." Finch scoffed. "For now." A muscle in Silas' jaw tightened violently. "You done, Langley?" The sheriff hesitated, his gaze moving between the unyielding man on the porch and the defiant woman in the yard. He gave a reluctant tip of his hat. "We'll let folks know, but if anything happens, it won't," Silas cut in, his voice like the crack of a whip. "I give you my word." The two men mounted and rode away, their departure leaving a ringing silence, thick with judgment. Abigail stood frozen, the wind whipping strands of hair across her face. "They think I'm poison," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "Let 'em," Silas grunted, turning back to the cabin. He paused at the door. "They don't know you. Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You're making an enemy of the whole town. For me." He turned fully to face her, and the raw intensity in his eyes stole her breath. "Because when I saw you on that porch, half dead but still fighting, I saw something I thought was gone from this world. And maybe," he took a step closer, his voice dropping to an intimate, husky murmur, "maybe I'm selfish. Maybe I want to keep it right here." He reached out, his rough thumb brushing a tear from her cheek she hadn't realized had fallen. The brief touch was an inferno, searing her skin. He wasn't just offering shelter. He was laying claim, standing between her and a world that wanted her gone, and she realized with a terrifying clarity that she wanted to let him. She wanted to be his to protect. Part 4. The Crucible of Fever. The fever came like a thief in the night, sudden and merciless. One moment, Abigail was mending James's coat by the fire, a fragile peace settling in her heart. The next, a violent chill racked her body, so profound her teeth chattered uncontrollably. By midnight, the chill had become a raging fire. She was burning from the inside out, lost in a delirious labyrinth of fragmented memories and half-formed fears. She whispered for Thomas, her dead husband, for her mother, for anyone who wasn't there. Silas found her, half-conscious, her skin like hot coals to the touch. In the corner, Emily was crying, a small, frightened sound, while James stood frozen, his eyes wide with terror. "Mama's shaking," he whispered. A terrifying stillness came over Silas. He moved with a predator's focus, a man possessed by a single, desperate purpose. He barked an order at James to watch his sister. Then he was at Abigail's side. For 3 days and 3 nights, he was a constant, unwavering presence. He bathed her forehead with cool cloths, forced sips of broth between her cracked lips, and held her down when the violent shivers threatened to throw her from the cot. He did not sleep. He did not rest. He simply fought, a silent, desperate war against the sickness that was trying to steal her from him. He had lost to this particular demon once before. He would be damned if he lost again. Through the haze of her delirium, she was aware of him. His low, rumbling voice, murmuring things she couldn't understand, was a steady anchor in the storm. His scent, pine, leather, and sweat, was a constant grounding presence. His touch, when he would lift her or hold her hand, was a conduit of raw, stubborn strength, as if he were trying to pour his own life force into her. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. She woke to the feeling of sweat cooling on her skin and the blessed relief of a clear mind. Her breathing was steady. She blinked her eyes open, feeling fragile as spun glass. Silas was slumped in a chair beside her, his head lolling forward in sleep, but his hand was still clasped firmly around hers. He looked exhausted, haunted, the harsh lines of his face softened by sleep. "You stayed," she rasped, her throat raw. His head jerked up, his gray eyes instantly alert, the brief vulnerability gone. "Where else would I be?" he growled, but there was no heat in it. Tears of gratitude slipped down her temples. "You saved me." He just tightened his grip on her hand, a silent acknowledgement that was more powerful than any words. That night, as she sipped water by the fire, wrapped in every blanket he owned, the children asleep beside her, she asked the question that had been hanging between them like a ghost. "You told me a storm brought you here. What happened, Silas?" He stared into the fire for a long time, the muscles in his jaw working. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollowed out by grief. "I had a wife, Sarah, and a daughter, Lily." He choked on the name. "Diphtheria. Took 'em both in a week. I did everything. The doctor prayers, nothing. I buried them, sold the ranch, and came up here. Figured if I couldn't be with people, I wouldn't have to lose him. His pain was a raw, open wound in the small cabin. Her own grief rose to meet it. She reached out, her hand resting on his arm. The muscle beneath was hard as rock. I'm so sorry. He looked from the fire to her, and his eyes were full of a terrible, desolate loneliness. Didn't think I'd ever open that door again, he said, his voice thick. Didn't think I'd want to, but you did, she whispered. Yeah, he breathed, his gaze dropping to her hand on his arm, then moving up to her face. The air crackled, charged with an emotion so potent it was almost unbearable. I did. He leaned in, his face just inches from hers. And God help me, Abigail, he murmured, his voice husky with a desperate burgeoning passion. I don't regret it. Not for a second. He didn't kiss her. It was too soon, too fragile. But the promise of it, the raw, wanting heat in his eyes, was a brand on her soul. In that moment, she knew their shared grief had forged a bond that was becoming something else entirely. A fierce, dangerous, and undeniable love. Part 5. A ghost laid to rest. The fragile peace was shattered by the baying of a hound and a drunken, slurred shout that ripped through the midnight cold. Rourke, I know you're in there, you damn hermit, hiding that witch. Silas was on his feet before the last word had faded, his face a thundercloud of cold fury. The memory of losing his family, so freshly unearthed, had turned his protective instinct into a razor's edge. Stay inside, he commanded Abigail, his voice a low, deadly growl. Lock the door. He grabbed his rifle and slipped out into the night like a phantom. Abigail's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She herded the children away from the window and waited, every nerve screaming. Outside, Silas moved through the snow-dusted trees, a shadow of vengeance. He found Lester Crowley near the well, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in one hand, and a revolver in the other, his face contorted with ignorant rage. She's bad luck, Crowley spat, waving the gun wildly. Brought a curse on this town. I lost a calf the day she showed her face. Go home, Lester, Silas said, his voice preternaturally calm. He stepped from behind the barn, the rifle held loosely at his side. Crowley laughed, a high, unhinged sound. Not till I see her gone. You're really protecting her? A no-name tramp? After what you lost? Have you forgotten Sarah? The name was a lit match on gasoline. A muscle leaped in Silas' jaw. It's because of what I lost, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. That I won't lose her too. The statement, so simple and absolute, was a confession. A vow. It was everything he hadn't been able to say to her, spoken now to a drunken fool in the dead of night. Lester, too drunk to understand, raised his revolver. I'll send her back to hell myself. Silas didn't hesitate. The rifle came up, a seamless extension of his will. One shot. Clean and final. The revolver dropped from Lester's hand as he crumpled to the snow, a dark stain spreading across his coat. The cabin door creaked open. Abigail stood framed in the light, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with a fierce, unwavering trust. The children were behind her, silent. Is it over? She asked, her voice steady. Silas looked from the body in the snow to the woman on the porch. The woman he had just killed for. The woman he would kill for again. He gave a single, sharp nod. For tonight. He walked back towards the cabin, the snow crunching under his boots. As he stepped onto the porch, he didn't stop. He walked right to her, dropped the rifle, and framed her face with his hands. His thumbs stroked her cheekbones, his gaze burning into hers. All the unspoken words, all the simmering passion, all the desperate protective fury culminated in that one look. He was wrong, Silas rasped, his voice thick with emotion. You're not a curse. You're the opposite. And then he kissed her. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was a desperate, hungry kiss, born of fear and loss, and a love so fierce it bordered on madness. It was the taste of gunpowder and pine, of desperation and salvation. Abigail melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, kissing him back with all the pent-up loneliness and burgeoning hope in her soul. This was not the quiet, comforting love she had known before. This was a wildfire, a storm, a wild and untamed thing perfectly suited for this wild and untamed land. They had both been ghosts, haunted by the past. But in that kiss, with a man laid to rest in the snow, they finally began to live. Part 6. A future forged in fire and snow. Spring arrived in hesitant whispers, melting the snow in patches and coaxing green shoots from the frozen earth. The town, after the initial shock of Lester Crowley's death, had settled into a wary silence. Silas had ridden in, told the sheriff exactly what had happened, and his word, backed by his reputation, had been enough. The story of the protective recluse and the witch he harbored slowly transformed into a local legend, a tale of Wild West justice and unlikely love. The change in Abigail was profound. The haunted, fearful woman who had collapsed on the porch was gone. In her place was a woman imbued with a quiet strength, her eyes clear, her hands steady. Her love for Silas, and his for her, was the bedrock on which she was rebuilding her life. It wasn't a love of soft words and flowery promises. It was a love of shared chores, of knowing glances across the cabin, of him silently carving a new doll for Emily, of her stitching a patch on his coat. It was a love that lived in the heat of his hand on the small of her back as they stood on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. One day, as Silas was mending a fence line on the far ridge, the familiar deep ache started in her lower back. She knew it instantly. The baby was coming. Too soon. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up her throat, but she beat it back. She was not the same woman. She was Abigail Moore, and she was Silas Rourke's woman. She would not falter. She calmly boiled water, laid out clean linens, and sent a terrified but obedient James to light the signal fire they had planned, a pillar of green pine smoke. Then she braced herself. Contractions came, savage waves of pain that stole her breath. She knelt by the bed she now shared with Silas, gripping the wooden frame, her body trembling with exertion. She prayed not for rescue, but for strength. Hours passed. The pain was a roaring ocean, and she was a small boat tossed upon it. Just when she thought she could endure no more, the door slammed open. Silas rushed in, his eyes wild, his chest heaving. The smoke. I came as fast as I could. He didn't hesitate. He was there, his hands sure and steady, his voice a low, calming rumble in her ear. He supported her, held her hand, and whispered words of love and encouragement as she bore down with the last of her strength. And then, as dusk painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, a new cry echoed in the small cabin. A tiny, perfect boy, slick with birth and screaming his defiance at the world. Abigail sobbed with relief and joy as Silas, his rough hands infinitely gentle, wrapped the baby in flannel and placed him in her arms. "He's here," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Silas, he's here." Silas brushed the damp hair from her forehead, his own eyes shining with an emotion so profound it left him speechless. He leaned down and kissed her, a long, tender kiss full of awe and reverence. Then he kissed his son. "You're both here," he finally managed to say, his voice thick. The next morning, he carved a name into a small cedar plaque, Thomas Rourke, for the husband she had lost, and for the family they had now found. He placed it at the foot of the cradle he had built. That evening, they stood on the porch together, Abigail holding their son, James and Emily chasing fireflies in the twilight. The world was quiet, peaceful. "I came here with nothing," she said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her and the baby tight against his side. The scent of him, the solid strength of him, was her home now. "And now," he murmured into her hair. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a love so deep and wild and powerful, it mirrored the mountains around them. "Now," she said, her voice full of certainty, "I have everything." He lowered his head and kissed her, a slow, deep promise under the endless, star-dusted sky. They were not two broken people anymore. They were a family, forged in the crucible of a blizzard, tested by judgment, and sealed in blood and birth. A Wild West story not of endings, but of the most untamed and beautiful beginning. In the unforgiving heart of the Wild West, where life is as fragile as a frost flower and twice as fleeting, a single act of compassion can ripple outwards, changing the landscape of a life forever. The story of Abigail and Silas is a testament to this truth. It teaches us that home is not a place on a map, but a fortress built in the heart of another. It reminds us that family is not always the one we are born into, but the one we are brave enough to fight for. Theirs is a lesson in second chances, proving that even from the ashes of unimaginable grief, a love that is fierce, passionate, and untamed can rise. It shows us that true strength isn't the absence of scars, but the courage to show them, and to find the person who sees them not as damage, but as a map of the soul they have come to cherish. If this tale of survival and wild love resonated with you, please consider subscribing to Wild West Stories. Like this video and share it with others who appreciate that the best stories are written on the human heart.